while the first industrial revolution is centered in England, the second industrial revolution is centered in the United States and Germany. It will begin in the mid-1800s, roughly after the Civil War, and because of its size, Germany will not be able to compete with the United States. Keep that in mind. It's very important. The second industrial revolution is what will transform all of society and the economy into the modern urban industrial form that we know today. Obviously, there have been massive changes since then, but the second industrial revolution is the revolution that will truly change everything about humanity in a much bigger way than the first industrial revolution. And there are a couple of reasons for that. There's a couple of reasons that it's bigger. The period that we are talking about is often called the Gilded Age. Well, it's called the Gilded Age in the United States, but because the United States is the dominant power during this, it is the title that has stuck. The Gilded Age refers to this term because of a book, actually, by Mark Twain. Mark Twain is one of those rare individuals that is able to observe the world he is living in at that moment and describe it accurately. His book, The Gilded Age, Tale of Today, was meant to be a critique of the period. It was written in the 1870s, and he was criticizing it because to gild something is to cover it in gold. So go out, walk your dog, pick up its business, dunk that business in gold, and you have a gilded piece of poop. It's pretty on the outside, but you just scratch off the gold surface, and what do you have? Still poop. That's what he's saying by calling it the Gilded Age. While the industrialization and urbanization and the wealth, massive amounts of wealth, were very pretty on the outside, there was a lot of greed, corruption, pollution, abuse, exploitation underneath. Now, he probably went too far in his criticism of the second industrial revolution because he really disliked it. But there were definitely things to criticize about it. And we will talk about those. So, why exactly was the second industrial revolution centered on the United States? A couple of reasons. First, the United States just stole England's ideas. And this was intentional. It's kind of interesting. The U.S. actually stole ideas from England, intellectual theft. We also, in the United States, they also mass-produced and dumped cheap goods in England. Basically, everything the United States in 2024 criticizes China for, the United States did to England. It was actually Alexander Hamilton's plan. Hamilton's report on manufacturing and his reports on the Bank of the United States, all of his ideas, he was basically stealing them and trying to improve on them from England. So, as mentioned before, the United States could have industrialized a lot sooner, but Jefferson and Jackson, it's unfair to blame them as individuals. The majority of the population did not want to industrialize. The majority of the population wanted to remain agricultural, and progress was very slow. But after the Civil War, when the North was able to enact policies that will just explode the U.S. manufacturing, it will just take all sorts of ideas from England. So a lot of the stuff England did, the US just copied and then improved upon. So that's the first reason. Second reason is the United States was, when it came to a manufacturing-based economy, so when you talk about industry and manufacturing, what that means is taking a raw material and turning it into something that is final product. And the U.S., it was almost destined to become the global superpower in a manufacturing-based economy. And it's very important to understand that it's specifically talking about a manufacturing-based economy for geography alone. Well, so first, obviously, the U.S. adopted those institutions that England had: capitalism, representative democracy, and religious freedom. But then it had a geographic advantage. Partly, it was just massive. The U.S. is geographically enormous, which, especially when you compare it to all of Europe and also Germany, that means the United States in a manufacturing-based economy is just going to do better, because unlike the largest countries in the world, Russia and Canada, the United States, very, very little of it is not usable. The United States has tons of natural resources, and so it is able to use those natural resources to produce manufactured goods. So during this period we're looking at, between 1870 and 1900, not 30 years, even agricultural output, so not even talking about manufactured goods, agricultural output will more than double because of the size of the United States. We will produce new inventions to mechanize and make agricultural better, so agricultural output will double, and the U.S. will outproduce every other nation in the world in agricultural goods even. So it's not even talking about manufacturing goods, but being able to produce that much agricultural goods will make it so the United States is able to produce more manufactured goods. Manufacturing centers, they need raw material, they need food. So the United States geography makes it so it just could not be competed against, essentially. But also, this is really important in the manufacturing-based economy, in the manufacturing-based era. The U.S. is effectively an island. And it obviously has neighbors, but no neighbors that can threaten it militarily. And so the United States, in a manufacturing-based world, it is essentially protected from those other nations. Or from, well, it doesn't have to worry about Canada and Mexico, and it is a very long distance for every other nation, so it is protected. So it didn't have to spend a lot of its resources on the military and defense, like basically every European nation did. So geographically, it is a phenomenal place. It's kind of interesting also, in our current era, in the digital age, geography actually doesn't matter nearly as much. That's why the U.S. has been attacked, had multiple cyber attacks, and it's falling behind in terms of keeping up with cybersecurity. So a very important lesson is the country that enters a new economic era, as we saw with the Netherlands, as we saw with England, it usually falls behind because it doesn't adapt to the new economic era that comes after it. So just something to think about. So the second big point, the reason the United States will become the most advanced country in the industrial era is geography. A third reason is the United States just had this long tradition of individualism. We are an insanely individualistic country. Individualism is individualism, another way to describe it is liberty, which is a synonym for freedom, and we love our freedom in this country. The U.S. was founded by joint stock companies, so it was founded by early corporations, and we are obsessed with making money. We are insanely pro-business, and we have a natural antipathy to the government. Take it to a weird extreme in this country, where we don't mind if businesses are screwing us over, but if the government does, a good example of that is I heard someone complaining about the government spying on us, the government Big Brother watching us, like that book 1984. This person has a Facebook account, a Twitter account, an Instagram account. Like, they're giving away their information freely to companies, because that's fine. As long as it's business that's, taking advantage of me, that's whatever. Government, though, no. So America has a long history of being insanely pro-business, very anti-worker, which, has its negatives, but obviously also has its positives. It's the reason the United States is the richest country the world has ever seen. And it is just so deeply ingrained in American society, that individualism and the pursuit of wealth, it even pervades our religion. This is a speech by a minister from the time, famous speech called Acres of Diamond. Let me say here clearly and say it briefly. 98 out of 100 of the rich men of America are honest. That is why they are rich. That is why they carry on great enterprises and find plenty of people to work for them. It is because they are honest men. If you believe that, I'm very happy for you. That is, if you believe that rich people are just inherently more honest, I would never go the other direction and say that the poor are inherently more honest. I do not believe that. But to believe rich people are just inherently more honest, that defies reality. But it is just so heavily ingrained. One of the most famous ministers, Henry Ward Beecher, the brother of Harry Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, God has intended the great to be great and the little to be little. It is true that $1 a day is not enough to support a man and 5 children if the man insists on smoking and drinking beer. Is not $1 a day enough to buy bread? Water costs nothing. The man who cannot live on bread and water is not fit to live. That, you won't be tested on this. This is purely my conjecture, but it is very, very difficult for me to read the New Testament and the writings of Jesus and the words of Jesus and make this statement make sense with what Jesus said. Be more difficult for a rich man to get into heaven than a camel to go through the eye of a needle. The poor shall inherit the earth. I mean, it's just very, this isn't to criticize the United States. It's just one of those facts. It has a lot of positives and negatives that come along with it. But in the United States, we are obsessed with individualism and obsessed with the idea of making money and being very, very pro-business. So that will, of course, lead to policies that will very much benefit businessmen and also industrialization. The fourth reason is the United States will become the new hub for immigration. Now, immigration is a very hot topic, and immigration needs to be controlled. It needs to be organized. Open borders are a bad idea. But large numbers of immigrants into the United States is correlated with a strong economy. And the immigrants that will come into the United States during this period and the huge surplus of labor is a huge factor in the United States industrializing. Between 1870 and 1900, the population of the United States will almost triple from 31 million to 92 million. And part of that was due to people living longer, but mostly it was due to immigration. There will be so many immigrants coming into the United States that in 1892, the United States will open Ellis Island in New York in order to bring more people in. Now, obviously, we had other periods of large periods of immigration before. The 1840s and 1850s, most immigrants were from Northern and Western Europe, so a lot of German, Scottish, and Irish. And even then, Americans went crazy. Every time there's a large number of immigrants that come into the country, Americans go nuts. And there was a whole political party created against immigrants. They called themselves the Know Nothing Party. They were big in the 1840s and 50s. Lincoln hated them. But that's the whole thing, is they hated immigrants. During this period, there will be what are called new immigrants. And that is immigrants that will mostly come from Southern and Eastern Europe. So Italy, Greece, Poland, Hungary, Russia, Lithuania. And these ones were different because Southern and Eastern Europe, they were mostly not Protestant. They were Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. And that will just set Americans off. Because again, anytime there's a large number of immigrants, Americans are always set off. And every time there's reasons why these immigrants are totally different, and these are the ones that are going to destroy the country. But it is, the backlash against it was enormous. Obviously, also, when immigrants come to the country, they're very rarely, they're almost never wealthy. They're almost never highly educated. I believe people from Asia in the last 20 years are the most highly educated and wealthy group of immigrants in U.S. history. 25% of them come with a college degree. But that is abnormal. The vast majority are very poor. They move into enclaves with people of their same background and ethnicity, and they create ethnic enclaves that we still see to this day. If you go to New York or Chicago, you see Little China, Little Italy, Little Poland. By 1880, a majority of the population in New York could not speak English. By 1900, Chicago had the second largest Polish population of any city in the world behind Warsaw, Poland's capital. So there was just a massive amount of immigrants, and we'll come back to this. There was a lot of good science at the time that showed why these immigrants are genetically inferior human beings. It's a period of scientific racism. Again, we'll come back to that. So overall, while immigrants will cause problems if there's too many of them and they're brought in without any control, throughout U.S. history, immigration is associated with a good economy. So that is a big reason the United States will become the epicenter of the Second Industrial Revolution. Second Industrial Revolution could not have happened at the rate and pace it did without this. Fifth reason, and this one is really important, the United States will have two revolutions in business. So it is obviously expanding upon what England did, but there will be two revolutions in business in the United States. One is a revolution in technological innovation. Now, just like with England, the United States will have a patent office. In fact, the United States based its patent office off of England. So there will be a lot of technological innovations, and those innovations will create both new products and improvements on old products and machinery that will lead to mass productivity. And the burst of technological innovation during this period was enormous. So, for example, definitely don't have to memorize these numbers, but the U.S. Patent Office was first opened in 1790 at the beginning of the country, and from 1790 to 1860. So for 70 years, first 70 years, there will be about 30,000 patents taken out, 30,000 inventions. Between 1860 and 1890, so the next 30 years, there are more than 440,000 patents taken out. It is an explosion on patents, and there are so many of them you can't list them all. Farm implements that made agriculture more productive, steam engines, the barbed wire, vacuum cleaners. But one of the most important inventions of this period that is absolutely crucial to the Second Industrial Revolution was steel. This is one of the single most important developments which will be centered in the United States. And it's not that steel hadn't existed, it is that there will be a new process called the Bessemer process by a guy named Sir Henry Bessemer, invented in 1856, and it will make steel easier to produce. It will make it much faster, much cheaper, and with fewer people, which means you can produce a whole lot more of it a lot faster. And this is the backbone of the U.S. becoming the industrial power. Because with steel, obviously, that is how you make railroads. And railroads will be absolutely crucial to the United States becoming an industrial power. The U.S. produced so much steel during this period, the amount just explodes every year. And by 1900, the United States is outproducing England, France, and Germany combined in steel. This is one of the most important ways the United States will lead other countries in terms of technological innovation. Random fun fact, you don't have to know this, but Soviet Union, they will ramp up steel production. One reason socialism does not work and has never worked is well after the Second Industrial Revolution, after World War II, Russia, the Soviet Union will still be producing tons of steel because the government says, oh yeah, we're going to produce steel. And the economy, the world had moved past that. But obviously, in a socialist system, you have government control of all industries, and the government's like, no, keep producing steel. And that's why capitalism works better, because in a capitalist system, it's based on supply and demand, and when there's no demand, you stop producing as much. So there will be a massive, massive production of steel, which is absolutely crucial to the United States becoming the epicenter of the Second Industrial Revolution. And it's not that steel was new, but it's the new process of producing steel. And the person that will especially embody this is Andrew Carnegie. He was an immigrant from Scotland. Started really poor and worked his way all the way up. So the United States will become the epicenter of steel production and the mass production of steel. Another major invention and just a key feature of the United States becoming the epicenter of the Second Industrial Revolution is electricity. Electricity will be instrumental in the entire process. It was invented in the 1880s, and there'll be a breakthrough in the 1880s. And it will obviously change communication. It changes power. It changes if power efficiency of machinery and spur growth and production. It makes cities more livable. It will lead to electric trolleys, subways, and it makes steel production, chemical production more better, and it makes steel and chemical production better and more efficient. It leads to the creation of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell. But the bigger point than just electricity is the Industrial Research Lab. And what that means is companies will actually just start putting money towards invention for the sake of invention. And it's important that this isn't like the government is just doing this, or this is like businesses that are inventing. It's called research and development for the sake of creating new inventions. And the best example of this is Thomas Edison. People think he was a great inventor, and he wasn't. He was a great businessman, and he was a professional inventor in that he created an industrial research lab and hired scientists and inventors to create stuff, and then he would get to patent them because he is the one that owns the company. He is kind of like the equivalent of Elon Musk today. Sorry to all the Musk fanboys out there, but Elon Musk is not the super genius that knows everything about rockets and everything. He just hires people that does know about this stuff. Then it's not to discredit Edison or Musk, but the Industrial Research Lab is what will set the United States apart from other places. And in Edison's own factories, they'll invent stuff like storage batteries, electric motors, electric transmissions, all sorts of stuff. Edison will demonstrate the importance of research and development, which is absolutely crucial in advanced economies. And fun fact, he will also be the founder of, it was called Edison's General Electric Company, which is now GE. It's supposedly one of the, I think it's the top 20 most profitable country. It used to be one of the top 20 most profitable companies in the world. I don't know where it sits now. I'm pretty sure it's been replaced by a tech company. So that is one of the major reasons the United States will excel above other nations is industrial research. And that leads to more R&D, more technological innovation. The second thing, and this one is crucial and is especially important in the United States, is the rise of what's called big business or modern day corporations. And this is new. We had manufacturing before this. Before the second industrial revolution, there were manufacturing factories and workplaces, but they were small. The owners worked in the factories with people. They would know their workers' names, and they would usually work alongside them. With the advent of modern-day corporations, now you have this massive bureaucratic structure that is absolutely huge. There will be a person at the top, like the Andrew Carnegie's, John D. Rockefellers, and then they will have, managers who manage managers who manage. You have regional managers, then you have factory managers, then you have under factory managers, people that manage their divisions or departments, and below them you will have the workers. So it is a hierarchical system, but the important thing about these massive corporations is they are hiring hundreds and thousands of workers. The owners of these, the people at the very top, they would not set foot inside of their factories, and they would have no idea who their workers were. And so they have absolutely no connection with their workers. But these large corporations are so important because without them, we will not get mass production. And mass production is vitally important. But these large corporations will completely change everything about business and the economy. These corporations, these businesses, will be so big, they will be bigger than some countries. And this is really crucial to understand, because this is one of the crucial things to understand about why this period is so different, besides the fact of mass production, which we'll come back to. But you have businesses that are now larger than governments, and they will have more money and power than governments, and so basically they will buy the government. So what we will get from this period on is companies, corporations that are so big, they will show that can government be oppressive? 100% absolutely. Throughout human history, the most oppressive thing is government. But from this point on, what else can be oppressive? Business. And that is something that I think, especially in the United States, there's a little bit of disconnect, thinking that only the government is oppressive and business is somehow benign and not oppressive. I'm not saying all businesses are bad. I would never say something like that. But business can be absolutely as oppressive as the government can. And the very first big business, the very first large corporation were the railroads. Railroads is the first big business and major industry that will have large-scale management bureaucracies, and they will become absolutely enormous. And without the railroads, we could not have an industrial revolution. Unless you have an interconnected society, you cannot be an advanced economic system. That's why Alexander Hamilton called for this. It will take until after the Civil War for the United States to actually create a interconnected system. So this will allow raw materials to go to factories and to go to cities, and will also allow finished manufactured goods to go to rural areas. So actually, Abraham Lincoln called for this too. So Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln, there were a lot of politicians that called for these, but it would take until after the Civil War, after the South was out of the Union, for this to happen. And fun side note, Alexander Hamilton actually called for an international highway system. We will not get that in the United States until Dwight D. Eisenhower in the 1950s. So Hamilton was about 150 years ahead of his time in terms of economic thought. Also, just creating the railroads required tons of iron, tons of steel, tons of lumber, and so it will stimulate other industries. This is one of those transformative things that it creates other industries. It's able to interconnect rural and urban areas, connect raw materials to manufactured goods to rural areas. So there are entire graduate courses on just how influential railroads are, and that cannot be overstated. The 30 years from 1870 to 1900, number of railroad miles in the United States will increase by more than 550%. So it is absolutely enormous. And just to emphasize how business can corrupt politics, because railroads are good for everyone, they're good for societies, and railroads would determine whether a city would either succeed or fail. If a railroad went through your city, you're going to succeed. If it didn't, you were going to fail. So local, state, and the federal government will just give railroad companies tons of money. If you want to see some of the biggest corruption that Mark Twain had been talking about in his book, The Gilded Age, and some of the worst corruption during this period, it is with railroad companies. because they will have so much power and they will have so many congressmen in their pockets. They will pay off so many congressmen that the amount of land that they get, the amount of money and land that they get is enormous. Altogether, railroads will receive somewhere in the neighborhood of somewhere over $700 million in cash and over $300 million in land. So, is our railroads good for the nation? Absolutely. But the only reason they were able to succeed is because they got a ton of help from the government. And again, the idea that government is not necessary for a capitalist system to work or for business to function is incorrect. You need to have a system that works well. Now, there was just so much corruption in this case, though. Like, for example, they would get like a certain amount of land and acres for every mile, and so they would make these railroads that just made no sense and would go all over the place so they could get more miles so they could get more money. So the level of corruption was absolutely enormous. And fun fact, if you look at that map, what's going on with Texas? How come Texas didn't give any land to railroads? It did. Texas is the only state in the Union that got to keep all of its land when it became a part of the United States. By the stipulations of Texas being annexed to the U.S., it is the only state that got to keep its land. So the federal government didn't have any land to give railroads, but Texas will give away some 32 million acres to railroads. It's also, fun fact, why Texas is one of the few states that does not have a progressive income tax. It's not just because, we in Texas dislike taxes so much more than everyone else. No one likes taxes. It's because Texas has more oil under it than any other geographic area of its size in the world, I believe. It has an insane amount of oil, and so it is able to keep tax rates low. Same with Alaska. So, railroads, one of the first big businesses, and it very adequately demonstrates what happens with these new large corporations. Another large business is the petroleum industry. Petroleum industry will begin in the 1850s, and it starts in Pennsylvania. And when this happens, this is the beginning of oil being the most important natural resource in the world. It was cotton from the United States South, and that is replaced by oil. And we have been living in a world where oil is the most important natural resource ever since. However, we are moving away from that right now, which is part of the reason you see so many people losing their minds over so many things. Whenever there's an economic revolution and a technological and energy revolution, that process of creative destruction, people want to stop change. So it has been that way. We have had oil as the most important natural resource since this period. And obviously the person that is most associated with it is John D. Rockefeller. Like Carnegie, he was born relatively poor. He will start his first oil refinery in 1863, and by 1880, he created Standard Oil of Ohio, which eventually becomes Standard Oil of New Jersey, and he will eventually own 90 to 95% of all oil refineries in the United States. He is the first billionaire in U.S. history, and I don't know if it's still true, but he is one of the richest Americans of all time. Now, he was genuinely good at business. He put a lot of money towards research and development. He saved money, but he also engaged in practices that are blatantly illegal today in order to monopolize the entire oil industry, oil refining industry. So he will create a massive corporation that will be instrumental. And finally, the United States will also overtake England when it comes to investment. Do not know why that picture is off-centered. I will lose sleep over this. England had been the epicenter of investment capital, and you need capital in order to support business and the growth of business and entrepreneurs. But that will change. During this period, the money that is going to England for investment will start coming to the United States, including by British financiers. Obviously, they don't have loyalty to country. They care about money. And so they will start investing in the United States. And it is at least by the 1880s, 1890s, Wall Street and New York will overtake London as the financial capital of the world, which it has been ever since. And the most famous investment banker is J.P. Morgan, which his name is famous. Investment bankers, they are bankers that they don't do regular banking like commercial banking, like house and car loans. Investment bankers are the ones with lots of money that invest in businesses. And they invest in businesses sometimes to make them grow or to cut them up and basically sell them off. Mitt Romney was an investment banker, so you're talking about an insane amount of wealth. So for all these reasons, the United States will become the center of the second industrial revolution. Now, some people portray everything that happens with the second industrial revolution and the Gilded Age as just terrible. It's all bad. This is all uniformly negative, and businesses are just terrible and corrupt. And that is just absolutely 100% not accurate. There are a lot of benefits to this. And there are benefits that affect everyone. For one, with big businesses, you get increase in productivity. You are able to produce more, faster, and then cheaper, which means everything becomes cheaper. When you can mass produce, it means everything becomes cheaper, and that is good for everyone. So just one small example, if you lived in a rural area, you slept on a bed of hay. Once mass production happens, all of a sudden you are able to buy a mattress. Your life is going to get better, which leads, so only big business can have the level of productivity that brings the mass production that makes people's lives substantially better. And so second is there will be a higher standard of living. That's why the United States is one of the highest standards of living. More comfortable homes, more air conditioning later on, better food. So things just get better. And most importantly, not most importantly, if you lived in a rural area, your life was terrible until a railroad came. And then all of a sudden, its companies, Sears, Roebuck, Montgomery Ward, they started sending out these big pamphlets or binders with all this stuff you can buy. And so now you can buy stuff that you didn't have access to. This is the early version of Amazon. So now if you live in a rural area, you can order stuff from cities and your life just gets a little bit better. This point is very important. 1870 is a crucial period because after 1870, due to mass production, something that had existed all throughout human existence was there is dire poverty and there is this universal fear of starvation. if you didn't do everything exactly right, you could starve to death, and there was dire poverty. After 1870, that will go away for a lot of places in the world. Now, if you have a bad crop, you can still get food. You can still order food. If you have something go wrong, you can still order food. So the near universal dire poverty will substantially change in Western Europe and the United States after 1870. It'll spread to other areas over time, but that is one of the most important things about this is higher standard of living across will spread all over the world. Third, power. You cannot be the world superpower without being an industrialized nation. And while there are many problems with it, you still would rather live in the world's most powerful country economically and militarily rather than one that is not. For all the problems there are, and there are a lot of problems, and I'm happy to go into the problems, but it's still better than the alternative, is a simple way to put it. So there are just so many advantages to living in an industrialized nation. Also, those robber barons or those industrialists we're talking about, they will give a lot of their money to charity. They will donate huge, huge amounts to charity. Now, obviously, there are a lot of negatives to industrialization also. And go through this really quick. The second industrial revolution, the Gilded Age, is also called the Age of Exploitation. Those same industrialists that will give away tons of money, they will exploit the land, the resources, their workers, and even their customers and other businessmen. So it is a period of cutthroat competition, and it will be very ugly. And the important thing to understand is there is nothing stopping these businessmen from doing whatever they wanted because we had never seen big corporations before. So it's basically a free-for-all. Everyone can do whatever you want. So there is exploitation in all sorts of areas. For one, the environment. This is the same thing we are now seeing actually in India and China today. Their level of pollution that's happening in those cities is enormous. It's what the United States went through in the Gilded Age and later. There's no laws against pollution or anything, so there was massive amounts of pollution. And it was so rampant and so bad. The Rockefeller's very first oil refinery was on the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, and they just dumped oil into the water. The water will become so polluted that in 1969, it actually catches on fire. It is impossible to set water on fire. So for a river to be set on fire, that is a lot of oil in that river. That is a guy dipping his hand in the water. Obviously, after this, they'll pass, this will lead to passage of the Clean Water Act. But the level of pollution was just absolutely horrifying, and it was just everywhere. Cities were especially gross. A lot of the cities, what you're seeing there is horse poop. Like 500 in New York City in the 1880s, there was like 150,000 horses producing more than 500,000 pounds of manure a day, and they would just push it off to the side. So there's basically snowbanks of horse poop. So it was gross. There was also exploitation of individuals, of customers even. There's no laws against putting anything you want in food. We will eventually, obviously, create Food and Drug Administration, but that didn't exist, so you were allowed to put anything you wanted into anything, and you didn't have to label it. One of the famous medicine for women that were feeling sick for some reason was Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound. What it did not tell you was it's mostly alcohol. Well, not mostly, but it had like an insane amount of alcohol in it. And so when women weren't feeling well and they took some of this vegetable compound, they were getting drunk. And they were like, oh, I feel better temporarily. Of course you do. You're getting drunk. There's no law against that. It's one of my favorites. Cocaine toothache drops. For, you know, when your children are teething, if you give them one of these things, their teeth stop hurting so much for some reason. Didn't even try to hide what's in this one. So there, it is a free for all in terms of what is going into food. And I knew a guy that had a PhD that said with a straight face, we should get rid of the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, because when it was passed during this period, or during the progressive era that comes after this, businesses were corrupt, but businesses now aren't corrupt, and they wouldn't do something like this. To believe that is just, to me, insane. There was also, besides the environment having a lot of pollution, besides food and drugs being just insane, there was massive extremes in income inequality. To give you one example, John D. Rockefeller made about $50 million a year. Today, that is equivalent to about $1.8 billion a year. In 2023, $1.8 billion. The average wages of a factory worker in one of his factories was about $490 a year, which today would be about $18,000 a year. This is a man with a family of 4 or 5. Can someone survive on $18,000 a year? That is absolutely insane. And if everyone's poor, you know, that's fine. But when there's massive income inequality in a society, as we've talked about before, it's called the revolution of rising expectations. And when you can see these really wealthy people, it leads to instability. And the level of income inequality during this period was absolutely massive. And in the same cities, you'd see these absolutely massive mansions, and blocks away, you know, these just absolutely decrepit places. All the very wealthy people in this time, they had summer homes, because in the summer, with all that horse manure, cities would smell really bad when the heat was coming down on them. And at the same time, you had just horrible, horrible slums. So the dichotomy between people's summer homes, you know, the second homes, third homes, and the abject poverty that was taking place was horrifying to a lot of people, even at the time. Best estimates say that in 1900, the richest 2% of American families owned about 1/3 of the nation's wealth. And you do not want to know what those numbers are today. Last I checked, income inequality today is worse now than it was then, which I don't mean this for a hippie reason. I'm not a hippie, but it's just dangerous for everyone. The economy functions by consumer spending. 70% of the economy is consumer spending. So when you have this much income inequality, not only does it mean the economy is not working correctly, but also means people are going to see this stuff and it makes them mad. So there was huge income inequality, and there was just blatant abuse of workers. The fundamental problem for workers during this period is there's just too many of them. In 1860, there was about 3 million workers in manufacturing, and by 1900, there was about 13.5 million. So the biggest problem for workers is there was just too damn many of them. Since there were so many of them, owners could treat their workers however they wanted. and then just replace them if they complained. The average worker during this period worked somewhere in the neighborhood of almost 60 hours a week. So that's six 10-hour days. In the steel industry, it was 72 hours a week. It's 6 days a week for 12 hours a day. And once a month, they would switch between morning and night shifts. So you'd have to work in the steel industry for, you'd have a 24-hour day of working. It was absolutely insane. And obviously, they're working these kind of hours for the equivalent of $18,000 a year today. And there is absolutely no job stability or guarantee because there are so many workers. Well into the 20th century. It's not until we get to the 1970s, women could be fired if they get pregnant. So there is no sense of stability. And the United States was the only industrialized country in the world at this time that had no workers' compensation. That's what I mean when I say the United States, we are insanely pro-business and very much anti-worker. That's why today the United States is the only industrialized nation in the world that also doesn't have national maternity leave. It's the only industrialized nation that allows citizens to go bankrupt for healthcare costs, and why we have the most expensive healthcare system in the world. It's because we will not put regulations on business because you're interfering with business. Or we won't put regulations on on the medical field. Texas recently passed a law saying you cannot work. Construction workers do not have a guarantee for a water break. There used to be a law saying if you worked in the construction field or anything outdoors, you had a guaranteed water break, and they removed that. Hell, if you live in Texas and you step foot outside, you should have a guaranteed water break just for walking outside, regardless of if it's for a job or not. Because there was absolutely no workers' compensation in Texas or in the United States during this period at any level, unsurprisingly, the United States had the highest accident rate in the world. In the 1890s, about 25,000 to 35,000, there were about 25,000 to 35,000 deaths and about a million injuries per year. There were certain jobs called roughneck jobs, and those were jobs, that's slang for people that were in dangerous professions, like railroads. It was insanely dangerous. In roughneck industries, the death rate was about 40% would either die or be seriously disabled. 40% of people in those industries. Railroads was one of them. Steel was another one. And also, if you worked in one of these industries and you got your arm chopped off, what do you get? Fired, because you don't have an arm. There is absolutely no workers' protection or workers' compensation. And the United States actually is moving back towards the Gilded Age in that respect. We're passing laws to make it harder. If you were injured or killed on the job, as the worker during this period, you had to prove that you had not been negligent. So according to the courts, it is assumed that workers were being negligent if something happened to them, and they had to prove they weren't being negligent, which, how do you prove a negative? It's very, very, very difficult. So only about 2% of the people that were injured or killed ever got any claims. If your husband worked for one of these factories and they happen to be killed, then what do you get? You're a wife with 4 kids. What do you get? Nothing. So it is dog-eat-dog world. Also, the U.S. had absolutely terrible child labor. The child labor situation was just incredibly sad. And we know the situation that was happening because of a guy named Louis Hine. He is a journalist. He went around the country taking pictures and getting stories. And this kid here is 5 years old. This is St. Louis, Missouri. He's only 3'5". He is 5 years old. He is working 8-hour days selling newspapers. This kid here is 7 years old, so you're just sending the kids out, work all day. The worst industry was the coal industry. That kid sitting in the back with the stick, he is older. He is in his teens. His job is to take that stick and hit the kids when they fall asleep. Because, for some reason when kids work, kids have small hands, so they're able to sort out the coal. But, when 6 and 7 and 8-year-olds, when they've been sitting for 8 hours sorting, they get tired for some odd reason. And so his job is to smack them. He is promoted to being the person that hits them. But the coal industry was just incredibly sad to see. I love this picture, that kid on the far side that's smiling. I worked at Discount Tire for 3 years. I worked with that kid. A kid that when it was like 40 degrees out and you had to break the ice in the dunk tank so you could dunk the tires without gloves on in order to see where the air bubble's coming up, and he'd come into work like, "Hey guys, aren't you happy?" And everyone hated him. That's that kid. Cigar makers. They were like, these kids are between the ages of 9 and 14. And of course, if you're making cigars all day, what else are you going to do? Might as well smoke them. This oyster shuckers in Louisville, in Louisiana. These, that child in the front, that is a 3-year-old baby. The workers began at 3:30 in the morning and they ended at 5 p.m. That 3-year-old, there is no one to watch them. So that 3-year-old just hangs out with her mother, watches her shuck oysters all day. The situation for these families and these workers were just absolutely tragic. This is a woman, and this woman had her husband very rudely went off and passed away and left her with 11 kids. The 2 oldest ones ran off. The mother is in textiles, so she works at home in textiles, and she makes $4.50 a week. And all 9 of her kids that are still there work with her, and they work together $4.50 a week. And it was just insanely sad. So this is a world without any regulations. That's the key to understanding this. Whenever there's ever there's an economic revolution based on a technological revolution, there are new businesses that are unregulated. And we had never seen this stuff before, so there were no laws stopping any of this stuff from happening. That is why there will be a problem with monopolies. During this period, the companies would gather all their resources and take complete control of entire economies and industries. That's what John D. Rockefeller did, Andrew Carnegie did, and that's what a lot of them will do. And there is nothing against this because we had never seen these type of large corporations before. These large corporations would be so big, they will have so many workers and so much money that they will have more power than most people in the government, which is also why you see massive government corruption. The fundamental reason that you see so much corruption in the government is because companies owned the government. You could actually go to the Senate at this time and say that senator is owned by steel, that senator is owned by copper, that senator is owned by Standard Oil. The companies would actually just buy businesses. And they would just, sometimes it was just blatant. It was very blatant. So large corporations during this period would exert more power than the government did. Because the government would, during this period, just worked for business and did everything it could to help business. And then business would buy the government. This is what you call an oligarchy, ruled by the economic elite. And you wouldn't be able to say this was a true democracy during this period. Now, an important thing to understand is there was a debate for a long time. And people debated, do we call these people industrial statesmen or robber barons? Robber barons were people in medieval ages that would take the wealth from everyone. And industrial statesmen, that's people that are just really good at business. And there was a debate, and the debate was just incredibly stupid because they were both. They were incredible businessmen and they did really brilliant things in terms of business. And they were revolutionary, but they were also robber barons. But more importantly than that, and this is really important to understand, they did not make the Gilded Age. That is where people make the mistake of thinking that these individuals, they made the Gilded Age. And that is the wrong way to look at it. It's the reverse. The Gilded Age, this period, the Second Industrial Revolution, this new technological innovation allowed these individuals to get into an industry that had absolutely no regulations because they were new and novel, and allowed these individuals to become so powerful that they monopolized the field. And that is crucially important to understand. The individuals did not make the era made the individuals, because that happens with every single economic revolution. Few individuals are able to monopolize and take over, and they're always hailed as like these just absolute geniuses. And then later on, it will be determined that no, they weren't. They just were able to get in at the right time, monopolize their fields, and then have so much money and power that they are able to keep everyone else from joining into it. That is what we are living through now. During our current digital revolution, these individuals that are able to dominate the fields, industries, they're able to buy out or suppress their competitors. That's why there are so many antitrust suits. That's why Google is just had the Department of Justice just had a successful antitrust suit against Google because Google was engaging in practices that are blatantly illegal to stop other companies from being able to compete against it. I'm not going to go into all the specific business practices, but that is the way to understand these people. It is not that they are just unmitigated level of brilliance. It's not that they're dumb or corrupt or terrible, because they do all have levels of genius in business or in in inventions or creating something new, but they're able to dominate in an industry that is completely unregulated, and then they're able to squash all their competition. And so they are able to squash very good, intelligent other business people and to maintain their control. Overall, big takeaway, the Industrial Revolution is good for everyone. And it is the key event in human history that will make it so the world is livable. Obviously, people lived before, but life was just absolutely terrible. For most of human existence, this is very important to understand. There is this very delusional view that the world used to be so great, and pre-industrial societies were pure and innocent and things were great. That is just absolutely 100% incorrect. Subsistence farming was hell. You worked 24/7 and you were constantly threatened with starvation. The threat of starvation was the norm in human history until we get to the 1870s and we start having mass production and railroads that connect people that make it so you can actually get goods if you have a bad crop. So it absolutely led to a better world for everyone. It is good for society as a whole. And really importantly, every social revolution, every women's movement, every civil rights movement is preceded by an economic revolution. And that is really important to understand. Because when you have an economic revolution, you have people that start getting more money. When they have more money, they start having more time. And then when they have more time, they realize, I don't like the way I'm treated in the world. So after the first Industrial Revolution, we get the rise of just in the United States, we get the first women's rights movement, where in 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention and Elizabeth Cady Stanton call for the right to vote for the first time. They won't get it till 1919, but Second Industrial Revolution will lead to the Progressive Era, which is when women will get a lot more rights, including the right to vote. And also in the 1920s, women will get even more rights and liberation. After the Third Industrial Revolution, after World War II, that is why we will get what's called second wave feminism, and women will get rights to go to college and attend universities and stop being discriminated based on their gender. They'll have right to credit. So every social revolution is preceded by an economic revolution. That is so important to understand. To ensure social revolutions, to ensure that there is going to be rights for more people, you need to ensure that the economy is doing well, because the reverse is also true. When the economy collapses, as I speak right now in August of 2024, it is collapsing. Social issues generally lose ground, because when people are worried about how they're going to live, then how they're going to survive, then social issues generally do not get as much traction. So the very important takeaway of all this is economic revolutions, they're good for society as a whole, and they're good for humanity as a whole. But they are terrible to live through. When there is this much change, when there's this much change taking place, it is very, very difficult to live through. The Second Industrial Revolution, the Gilded Age, was difficult to live through, and I'm very sorry to say the period of the 21st century, it has been very difficult, and is going to get more difficult for a time, because they always are. But it is still better than it was before. Whenever there's massive change, there's creative destruction, there's people that are left behind, but it's good for society as a whole. The key is to adapt to those new changes, and how well a society and economy adapts, that's up to the individuals that are living through it. But ultimately, it is for the best as a society. That is the important takeaway of this.